Good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear us okay. Thank you for joining us this morning. If you're struggling to hear us, please let us know by dropping a message in the chats on your right-hand side of the screen. Make sure you've got your speakers turned on. If you are dialing in, just remember to switch off your microphones, please. Any other issues, do let us know. We've got assistance in hand here this morning. Welcome everyone. My name is Andrea Anastasiou. I'm a Policy and Engagement Officer here at the Go Lab, and I'll be chairing this morning's session. And I'm joined by Neil Stanworth. Welcome, Neil, and Claire Fitzgerald. Welcome, Claire. So for those of you unfamiliar with the work of the Go Lab, we are an academic centre of research and practice based at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. Very simply put, our mission is to deepen the understanding and improve the practice of outcomes-based commissioning, and within that, social impact bonds as well. And we do so by conducting academic research, looking at what works and what doesn't work, and the mechanisms by which outcomes-based approaches can help improve the provision of public services. We are very much practice-focused, and we use the insights generated by our research work to make sure that we provide practical support and advice to government officials, both in local and central government, for commissioning authorities across the country. And please do head to our website if you want to read more about the work we do, and if you want to access some of the resources we've developed for practitioners. As you see on the slides right now, the web addresses for the different resources that we've created. So as I've mentioned, I'm joined this morning by Claire Fitzgerald, who is a research fellow here at the Go Lab, and Neil Stanworth. He's one of our fellows of practice, and he's also a founding director at ATQ Consultants. Claire holds a PhD in public administration from the North Carolina State University, and her research focuses largely on performance, measurement, and management information used in decision-making, innovation studies, and networks. She has previously worked as a research scientist at the SAS Institute in the United States, and prior to that she's also worked in 2 state agencies in the United States. Claire is one of the lead researchers here at the Go Lab, and she works across a different range of projects, from evaluating the evidence base behind the impact of the social impact bonds in the UK, also critically investigating the mechanisms by which outcomes-based approaches are thought to enhance the delivery of public services, and she's also supporting certain projects to develop or improve their evaluation strategies. Neil, as I said, he's one of our Go Lab fellows of practice. He runs ATQ Consultants, a consultancy specialised in outcomes-based commissioning, including payment by results and social impact bonds. Neil has tremendous amounts of experience in this space, so over 25 years working in service improvement and public service reform. And he has worked extensively with both commissioners and providers on developing social impact bonds and payment by results approaches. So we're really lucky to have him here with us today. It's worth mentioning that he's also involved in the evaluation of the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund. And he's also the author of our technical guides on setting and measuring outcomes, which is available on the Go Lab website. And I should just say, as far as I'm concerned, it's great to have like 2 different perspectives this morning. So obviously with Claire, we have the academic perspective with more of an emphasis on the need to articulate really robust objectives outcomes that can be, I suppose, like measured with a really high degree of confidence. And the practitioner perspective, who is perhaps a little bit more sympathetic to the challenges on the ground and the need to perhaps sometimes negotiate and compromise to agree to a solution that's acceptable to all the parties involved. So Claire, Neil, thank you both very much for joining us this morning. Now I've introduced our 2 amazing speakers, and we'd also like to get a sense as to who we have in the audience this morning. So we've put together a very brief poll. So if you would all like to take 1 minute to just tell us what sector you work in. You should see the poll on your screens right now. So please get engaged, do vote. First vote, local government. That's good news, because a lot of the work we do is for commissioners in local government. Got a couple of people from health as well, academics, voluntary sector, so a really nice mix. It looks like the majority of representatives are from local government, which is great news for us. So welcome all. Okay. I'll leave it maybe a couple more seconds. Okay, so local government definitely in the lead. Health, voluntary sector. I've got a few representatives from the social investment as well. Right, now looking at what regions you work in mostly. London, Southeast. Okay, we've got a few international participants as well, which is really good news. And the last question for our audience is, are you currently developing outcomes-based contracts, payment by results, social impact bonds, and so on? A lot of yeses, so that's encouraging. So you are definitely on the right session, and I hope you'll find today's session helpful. Right, so moving on, you've obviously been asked to submit your burning questions in advance of the session. So as much as possible, we've tried to shape today's session on the basis of the questions you've submitted, and we are going to do our best to answer as many of those questions as possible. On the slides, as we go through the session, you'll notice that I've highlighted in red the questions we've received for you, in blue our responses, and we've made sure to include a lot of examples, and those are highlighted in green on the slides. And please feel free to submit more questions throughout the webinar. We will pause a couple of times to take questions from you. You could submit the questions at any time. I'll try to remind you throughout the session about that. So just really briefly in terms of the overview for today's session, so we will look at a number of key things, including clarifying some of the terminology used when talking about outcomes, then talking about the process of defining outcomes and how to identify the right ones. And surprisingly, we had a lot of questions around, how do you identify the right outcomes? It's a tricky question, so I look forward to discussing that with Claire and Neil. We will then also look into detail some of the considerations and challenges associated with measuring outcomes effectively, and then, hugely important, how to avoid creating room for perverse incentives or any other unintended behaviors. So without further ado, Claire, I'll come to you for the first question. So we know that by definition, obviously, setting the right outcomes and measuring them effectively are some of the most important aspects of an outcomes-based contract. But before we delve into all that, could you perhaps just say a few words about the other key ingredients that are required to ensure we develop a robust outcome framework?
Sure. So when we think through the key components of an outcomes-based contract, particularly, we think about three main ingredients, as it were. So there's this idea that you want to be particular about who is in the cohort receiving a particular service. You want to really have a good appreciation for the outcomes that you might be willing to pay for on behalf of that cohort. And then there's also this idea of what you're willing to pay, what the price is. And so I think what we're just trying to clarify that for today's conversation, we're focusing primarily on this number two, this idea of how you define the outcomes within the contract itself.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. And we'll come back to this framework later on. So I've mentioned terminology, Neil, and I know there's some, sometimes confusion. People use words like outcomes, measures, metrics. Could you sort of help us a little bit clarify the difference between all these different words? And is there universally a great definition?
No.
Probably not.
One of the most difficult things in this area is there are lots of people with different views of what constitutes what type of measure and what constitutes what type of definition of different stages in the process. When I was trying to put the guide together for GoLab, I spent more time on this than probably anything else. And what I don't want to do today is reopen a horrible debate about what is a good term and what is a bad one.
Friendly debate.
So measures and metrics is a good example. I decided for the purpose of the guide that a measure was one thing, a metric was something else. And the terminology that we chose was that the outcome is what you're trying to achieve. The measure is how you measure whether it's being achieved or is likely to be achieved. And the metric is the specific value you attach to it. But there are lots of other terms used like triggers and sustainment payments and all sorts of things in this terminology. What really matters is that you look at it as a progressive process.
Great. So just on this point, because you've mentioned measures and metrics, could you perhaps give us an example? It's always easier for people to get their head around.
Yeah, so there are a couple in the slide deck for this, but the simplest example, the one that's been around longest probably in terms of outcomes-based commissioning in this country is employment. So you can start with a measure saying you either have an outcome that you want more people to have jobs, more people to be in work, more people to be in employment, less worklessness, if you express it that way, and that's your broad outcome. You can then have a judgment of how you want to measure that, and you can measure it by checking with an employer that the person is indeed employed. But you then need a specific measure that says you want to pay against, that could be that the person is in employment for a minimum of 16 hours per week for a defined period. Or, and we'll be talking a lot about collective versus individual measures later, that 20% of the total cohort are in continuous
yes,
employment.
we'll come on to that. So another term that's often used in the context of developing outcome frameworks is the concept of proxy outcomes. Could you just clarify what proxy outcomes are, and then perhaps just reflect a little bit on why it's helpful to use proxy outcomes, or what might be some of the risks?
Where a very wise person in the local authority I was working with recently pointed out to me that nearly all outcomes are proxies, nearly all outcome measures are proxies, because it is very, very rare that you actually have a perfect measure of exactly what it is you're trying to achieve. But a proxy is an outcome you use because the direct outcome you're trying to achieve is either unobservable or very difficult to measure accurately. And there are literally hundreds of examples of where proxies are used. We put up a couple there. So
if we take the first example, for example, about health.
One, you see, there's quite a lot of health thought being given to health SIBs at the moment, areas like social prescription, which are very popular, and self-management of conditions. You could have an objective either you're trying to improve the health of the population or help more people to manage their conditions effectively. That's very hard to observe, will take quite a lot of effort. So a reasonable proxy for that is whether there is a reduced number of hospital admissions, either planned or unplanned, in relation to that specific condition, or indeed generally across all conditions. So that in itself becomes a proxy. The one that is probably most well known around the community is convictions at the bottom. So offending is a widely used measure and has been used in one of the very first SIBs, of course, Peterborough, and in the whole Transforming Rehabilitation programme by government. But measuring offending is virtually impossible because so much of it goes undetected. So what is measured is conviction, which has a fairly straight line arithmetical correlation with offending, but not always. So there are some risks in using it.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So in the technical guide you've written for the Go Lab, you also talk about lead and progression outcome measures. Yeah. How do those fit in?
Well, a lot of lead and progression measures are proxies, and they're often confused. I find people saying they talk about proxy measures, and what they mean is lead measures or progression measures.
So what's the difference?
Well, the main difference is that with a lead measure, you're looking for an indication of what will happen in the future, not necessarily what has happened. Nearly always, well, in fact, always, if it's a progression measure, clearly you're looking for something that will happen later. So, some examples again on the screen. Improved skill, attendance and behaviour has been used in the Youth Engagement Fund by government, and is now being looked at in a few SIBs that I've been working on, to give an indication of reduced risk of school exclusion, which is harder to measure and also much further away in terms of. It's often used because you're trying to do a preventative intervention and you don't want to wait for the final outcome before you start looking at whether you're getting to where you want to be.
Right, and sort of like last question on the point of definitions and terminology, perhaps a bit obvious, but could you clarify the distinction between soft and hard outcomes? And I suppose, again, a couple of examples and key considerations as to when it might be preferable to use hard outcomes.
Again, terms that are used a lot. Pedants like me often saying that's not strictly a hard outcome, that's not strictly a soft outcome, and then other people say actually it is, and we're in a long debate. But generally I say a hard outcome is anything that you can measure objectively. You know it's happened or it hasn't. That doesn't mean there won't be a dispute about whether it's happened, but certainly there is much less risk of disagreement about whether it's been achieved. A soft outcome is an outcome that requires subjective assessment of whether it's been achieved, and whether it often relies on either self-assessment by the recipient of the intervention or independent assessment by someone working with them, such as a case or link worker.
Okay, but presumably in an outcomes contract, you could have both?
In many outcome contracts, you do have both. You can also have situations where, if it's a social impact bond, the investor is being measured on a hard outcome, and the but the provider is being measured by the investor who is
Mm-hmm.
managing their performance in terms of a soft outcome.
Okay, great. Is there anything you wanted to add, Claire, on the distinction
No,
or
I
the
do
choices commissioners have to make around, going for hard or soft outcomes?
Sure. I do think that there's an important point to be made around where the data often comes for these kinds of outcomes. So often you see the sort of harder outcomes coming from administrative data, more routinely collected information from central systems. Soft outcomes tend to be the sort of self-report, survey-based primary data collection that sits behind many of these kinds of deals.
That's absolutely right.
Great, brilliant. Right, so I think we're going to stop for a moment now just to see if we've got any questions from our audience. So just as a reminder, you could just use the chat box to submit your questions. Doesn't look like we've received any questions so far. Maybe just give everyone a couple of seconds. Okay, sure. So we've got questions, and just to say, no question is silly or obvious, and I'm sure I'm going to be asking a lot of silly questions. So a question from one of our participants. People differentiating between outcomes and outputs when it comes to outcomes-based commissioning. Is there a way to define these terms?
So the
$1 million question, I suppose.
The real, I suppose, specific and maybe overly jargony term is this notion that it's something that your organization does. It's an effect that your organization produces on folks that are outside of your organization.
Yeah, I'd say that. So, and you also get inputs as well. So inputs is what you do, the output is what's produced by what you do, and the outcome is the effect what you have done has on somebody else, to keep it very, very crude and simple. Interestingly, these things do get confused quite a lot in outcomes-based contracts because quite a lot of payment can be attached to outputs. So the outcome could be that the program is completed, for instance, and that there'll be a payment attached to it, but that's strictly speaking not an outcome. There's also the grey area of saying a person has completed the program, which is very much in a grey area. That is an outcome, because for many people who've been disengaged and they're difficult to engage with, actually getting them to finish the program is a great achievement. So, but some people say that's not, academics particularly will say that's not strictly an outcome. So.
That's true. So I think academics spend quite a lot of energy trying to be very precise about what we mean definitions-wise. I think there's also the important notion that outcomes aren't necessarily interchangeable in terms of their value. And so while we spend a lot of time talking about the difference between outputs and outcomes, there's also a lot of important sort of delineations between early, mid, and late-term outcomes and the values that we put on those kinds of outcomes.
Okay, great. So I'll take another question from our participants, which is around the sort of government's approach, I suppose, in demanding hard or soft outcomes in outcomes-based contracts. I don't know whether you're in a position to comment, but have you seen a shift, a trend? Is the government becoming, I suppose, more rigorous in the demands?
There's definitely been market trends. So HMG, I mean, HMG in its own SIBs, if you talk about central government SIBs, Innovation Fund, Youth Engagement Fund, Fair Chances Fund, has been very comfortable using a mixture of hard and soft measures, a lot of progression measures, and we may come on to some of those because they're examples we use later. In terms of the funds that we've had, Social Outcomes Fund, which is HMG, Life Chances Fund, which is HMG, Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund, which is big lottery money. There's been trends over time, and in the market generally there's been trends. But when I started doing this stuff in 2011, there was very much in favour of hard outcomes and binary outcomes, in favour of something that was easy to measure. Investors would be very comfortable to invest in it. Then there was a swing towards softer outcomes, I think, and people realising how hard it was, excuse the phrase, to use hard outcomes in many cases. And I detect at the moment a bit of a swing back, because I think people have found something that we highlighted in terms of the risks of using soft outcomes, that the fact a soft outcome is expected to lead to a hard outcome doesn't necessarily happen, and therefore people are becoming, so what people are looking for a lot of the time is a blend, and I think that's a good thing. I'm not aware of anyone saying you must use a hard outcome.
Okay.
But you need to argue the case. If you're looking for someone else to pay for something, you need to argue the case for any outcome.
And you've mentioned earlier that setting outcomes is an iterative process anyway. So do you see in the projects that you've been involved in sort of advising on, I suppose, perhaps shape from starting with very ambitious, hard outcomes, perhaps more difficult to measure, and then moving on to softer outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, to give an example, I've looked at a couple of SIFs recently where there's a lot of concern around, in some areas, around the rates of permanent and fixed term exclusion from school. Those are hard negative outcomes for young people, that they're excluded from school. The obvious reaction to that in terms of setting an outcomes frame is that let's measure a reduction in some way in the number of exclusions from school. But we've, in a couple of projects I've been working on, I've found all sorts of challenges in using that outcome. One of the biggest is permanent exclusion is a high cost socially and financially, but there aren't that many of them, even in local authorities that are performing not very well. So using it as a measure is quite challenging. So you use other measures, and the Youth Engagement Fund kind of worked this out a few years ago by measuring behaviour in school, attendance in school, and attainment in school. And SIFs like the West London zone have also looked at those sort of measures. So you move in your thinking from saying, let's try that, to try something else.
Okay, but so kind of with this trend perhaps like towards softer outcomes, does that imply that the outcomes-based approach is perhaps like less rigorous, or is it, could you sort of still have confidence that you're achieving good value for money even if you're using soft outcomes?
Yes, I think you can have confidence, but that's why I think it is very useful to have both. And I think it's something we may touch on later. This is where evaluation comes in. It becomes very important. If you're using soft measures, or indeed if you're using tariffs to make assumptions about what will happen in terms of deadweight and things like that, then it becomes, for me, very much more important if you were to evaluate whether what you thought would happen did happen, so that you know whether you can with confidence use those measures again, or you need to try something else next time. I mean, probably the biggest single message today is that this is a learning process in most areas. There isn't a great amount of data and evidence that supports a perfect result every time.
Okay, well, I feel like everyone's still, looking for the, best practice examples or the exemplary practice, but I suppose there's no simple.
Well, for 30 years, I've never been a fan of best practice, but with good practice, I think, and certainly trying to learn from what's been done before. So what I've found in the last round of projects I've been doing in the last few months, particularly, has been a lot of, we tried that over there and it didn't work. So I wouldn't use that measure. I'd use this measure, which has worked very well.
So it's constantly testing.
And also, if you talk to investors and people who've invested in previous SIFs, okay, no, don't do that. Do this, because this one will work better. We'll be very comfortable with it. The providers will be happy to be measured that way. So
great, thank you. So I think we've got time for one more question from our live audience. So any thoughts regarding making the link between outcomes for individuals and the outcomes often required by commissioners? And I think we'll come on to this later when we talk about how to make sure that the voice of the service users is taken into account when developing outcomes. But do you have any sort of like immediate thoughts?
So a number of different projects operate on sort of a navigator, case manager orientation, right? So the service that's being put in place by the SIV is one of case management, or as I said, navigator, a link worker. And so some of these actual payments are being made on the production of personalized service plans and things like this, where the worker themselves is with a client and they work through exactly what their service experience is going to be like. So while they don't necessarily stipulate exactly what must be in the plan, there is this notion of personalization occurring. So I suppose I would think of that being a link between the two.
Right, well, my only immediate thought is that's why you often get a soft and a hard measure used together. So a hard measure will be what the commissioner ultimately wants to see happen. For example, in the question, reduced admissions.
Yes.
But it will also be important either because it's the only progression measure you have, or simply because you want to know. You actually want to know whether people feel better and people are happier as a result of the intervention they're receiving. There's obviously there's quite a lot, again, of concern in academic and in practitioner circles about making sure that the user doesn't get lost in all this, and that their concerns are always kept to the forefront.
Great, thank you both. So please continue to submit your questions. We will stop in about 20 minutes to take more questions. So if I go back to our slides, so we've talked, already about the decisions I suppose that commissioners have to make between, choosing the types of outcomes, which leads me quite nicely to this question around identifying the right outcomes. And one of the most common questions we've received from our participants is just simply, where do you start from when you start thinking about what the right outcomes might be, and what is the process of developing an outcome framework? So I'll come to you, Nigel, first for that.
I would start with a group of people in a room, is my first point about that. I think you need several people to think about the different issues from different perspectives, which may be from the point of view of whether people who understand the data and what's available, people who understand what the policy area is that you're looking at and are trying to achieve, and people who understand other issues, possibly people who understand its contractual challenges that I may come later. The word that springs to mind, which is on the slide, is iterative. Trial and error, to put it in a different way. It is rare to come up with the perfect set of outcomes very quickly. It is often, you can go down blind alleys, and you need to in some respects. I think that process has reduced to some extent over time as we're learning more about certain key policy areas. But if you're in a new area, if you're in an area where there isn't a lot of data or there isn't a lot of evidence from previous contracts or other people's experience, then there is no answer to simply thinking about it. There is a decision tree that we put in.
I think that's our next slide. Yeah. So let's see if we can get that.
This is my very crude attempt to say. But do you want
to talk us through maybe?
Well, yeah. The most obvious thing is the outcome aligned to what you're trying to achieve. So I used that example of exclusions earlier. We've talked about employment. SIBs that address children in care or on the edge of care. Is the child no longer at risk of going into care? Is the child reunified with their family in those sorts of areas? Are obvious outcomes that you can jump to relatively quickly. But if you come up with an outcome that is tangential to that and doesn't really work in terms of getting you where you need to be, then you might want to reject it fairly quickly. There's also, certainly I've detected quite a lot of people saying we really need to understand where, if it's a contract that is dependent on saving money, and they aren't always, they're dependent on trying to avoid some cost or reduce costs in a certain area, then it needs some fairly hefty alignment with that if you can get to it. So that would be a first test. And then you get to, well, having thought about that, can the outcome be measured at acceptable cost and effort? Often the answer is yes, because data is available, administrative data, as Claire mentioned earlier, but sometimes it isn't. So an idea that sounds great, you send the data guy or the data girl away to look at it, and they come back and say, no, sorry, that doesn't work at all well, because we're gonna have to set up a great deal of extra data collection effort to make it work. If the answer to that is no, then that's where you start thinking about proxies. So that example I used earlier, that somebody thought many years before I got involved in this stuff, we can't measure offending, but we know we can measure reconvictions or convictions for this, because they're in the court system. Everyone knows when it's happened. It's uncontrovertible. So at that point, you hopefully have got some clarity about what you need. And then you need to think about possible perverse incentives. I have to say, perverse incentives isn't a phrase I like very much, because it implies that everyone's behaving perversely. I think it's often things that just lead to unintended consequences, which may be deliberate or may be accidental. But what you don't want is outcomes to get you into the wrong place. But even though you say, well, this outcome works in all other respects, you don't want someone in the room saying, excuse me, we can't use that because it creates perverse incentive. Well, okay, let's manage that perverse incentive and avoid it, or mitigate it, rather than saying we don't use it, because otherwise we go back to the start. We don't want to go a snake and ladders game where we go right back to square one and start again.
Right, no, that's really helpful. And I think just to emphasize, this is a simplified decision-making tree. So it's not to say that if you crack this 4 questions or so, that's it, you've got your outcomes. And we'll come on to some of the complexities associated with measuring outcomes and things like attribution. So I see we've already got a couple of questions around that. So we'll come on to that. But I mean, I suppose it's just worth recognizing that it is a complex process and there are no straightforward answers, unfortunately. And sort of like just linked to this idea of like identifying the right outcomes, we've had quite a lot of questions around whether you can revise your outcome framework once you've put in a contract, and like how do you build in that flexibility, if that's what you want in your contract, to be able to review and revise the measures and the metrics as when needed?
Well, yes, I think you can. Well, you can definitely, and you should. I think another watchword is flexibility. Be flexible and iterative in developing the framework in whatever organisation you're doing it within, and make sure you involve others. The simple rule, really, if there is one, is if an outcome measure and its associated metrics or value is acceptable to the commissioner, the provider, and the investor, then it will work. If it isn't, then it's unlikely to work. So getting something that everyone agrees on is important. So the more you can involve all the parties in getting to the answer, the better your answer is likely to be. So be flexible in developing your thinking. If you're using advisors or you've got other sources you can look at, so what's worked before, which investors have invested in outcomes before in this area, and which ones did they invest in, those sort of issues. Then try and get some consultation going with those parties before you set things in stone. But even if you set things in stone, don't set them in stone, set them in plasticine. And there are live examples I'm aware of, but probably can't talk about on this webinar today, where outcomes are being heavily revised in real time. There are some documented examples from Australia, for instance, where the Newcomb bond was pretty much rewritten after a year, I think, something like that. So,
but is there a risk, and maybe I'm being controversial here, that you're diluting perhaps the robustness of the outcome framework if you revise it, if you're too flexible?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to highlight that one of the sort of espoused benefits of doing an outcomes-based contract or a SIB is that it does get people around a table in such a way that it provides some flexibility around how one manages the actual intervention, so that it is able to flex its way through particularly sticky points in the journey, as it were. And perhaps in other more rigid contracting arrangements, that kind of flexibility isn't necessarily present. So it's, I suppose, one of these blessing and curse kinds of things. Yes, you can sort of water down perhaps the efficacy of your outcome specification, but conceivably you also have the added benefit of keeping the project moving forward.
And it depends partly about what you saw the function of the contract being.
Sure.
If you saw it as being a rigorous test of whether a particular intervention worked, say an intervention that worked very well in the US but hadn't been tried in the UK, then you might want to be more rigorous in saying we're not going to change the way it's structured, even if that means we're not going to get the results we thought we were going to get. And in other cases, but in the majority, this thinking has moved a bit on this. I think people are saying that what we're trying to achieve is good outcomes. Good outcomes for lots of reasons, and therefore flexibility that enables you to achieve those outcomes and stops the contract falling over has become more important. So
yeah, I think that's a really important point, though, is that the sort of utility of a SIB is chiefly based on what you think it's going to achieve for you, and sometimes that isn't clearly articulated when these deals go through. There's not a clear rationale for why it's happening through a SIB as opposed to another mechanism.
How central is the voice of the service users when the different commissioners, providers, social investors, in the case of a SIB, come together to develop an outcomes framework?
I think service users should be heavily involved in deciding what the intervention should be and whether it's going to be effective. The mechanism that sits around it, I think it'd be quite hard to test whether it's effective that way. And I've not been aware of them being heavily involved in developing it that way.
No, I think user voice is something that we don't necessarily see as much as we would want, and certainly that will vary quite a bit on a project by project basis, but it isn't necessarily something that features in many of the conversations about SIBs.
Okay. Great. So sort of like moving on to some of the questions that we've received specifically around measuring outcomes. Would you like to say a few words about some of the key considerations that commissioners should keep in mind when setting out how they will measure the desired outcomes?
Okay.
I think we've got a slide on that actually, sort of just like summarizing, and again, just to emphasize, a lot of the information that we've included on our slides this morning is also available on the how-to guide on our website. So do check it out for more detail. This is just an overview.
There's a lot more words behind some of these concepts. General considerations, whether you're using individual or collective approaches. Some of the early SIBs were very much based on average performance across a cohort. Nearly all the SIBs I encounter these days, people tend to be jumping towards individual measurement and the popularity of tariffs or rate cards. So setting a set of values that relate to that individual. But I actually think the pendulum swung a bit too far. I think it's quite important quite early to think, is this an outcome that works best that way? However, picking up the very first slide that Claire spoke to, that depends heavily on what your cohort is. If you've got a tight cohort with similar characteristics, you can use individuals quite easily. It's something we may develop further. We talked about data. I noticed a question about data. It is important. There's a great example from the central government world of the early homelessness SIBs, which were going to measure health outcomes, and nobody checked that they could actually get the data from the Department of Health. As far as I'm aware, those SIBs were completed without them ever getting the data from the Department of Health. So they had an outcome on which people were being measured and rewarded that couldn't be measured at all, which is obviously not a good idea.
So on this point of, that obviously needing to have a robust measurement system in place, how do you create that, but at the same time ensuring that the measurement system is not too heavy, too bureaucratic, too, demanding for all the parties involved?
Well, I suppose it's just part of the consideration which outcomes you use in the first place. So what I say, you need the data person in the room, or you need to consult the data person, and they say, sure, that's fine. We're already collecting that data for DFE return, insert name and number of annual return they're doing. So we're already collecting that data. Classically, there've been a number of SIBs around care or educare. Every local authority will have reasonably good data on who's in care, where they are, how long they've been there, those sorts of issues. It's a statutory requirement for them to have that data. In other areas, you're moving into much more challenging data collection.
And of course, like a lot of the outcome-based contracts and social impact ones we're seeing in the UK are tackling really complex social problems. So I suppose like one of the questions that was submitted by one of our participants was around how outcomes can be measured effectively in complex contexts. So perhaps where you've got different organizations, different services being provided to the same target population. In those cases, how can the outcomes be reliably attributed to a particular project? Claire, do you?
So I think this is a really important question, which is essentially how do you make sure that you give credit where credit is due for the achievement of particular outcomes, especially if those outcomes are produced by a group of organizations as opposed to a single one. And increasingly, when you have individuals with complex problems, you need many, many organizations to work together to help them. And so one of the ways we've seen this sort of addressed or tackled is through structural decisions about how the actual service provider network is organized. And so I suppose in the UK, West London Zone is an example where you have sort of a hub organization that's bearing the responsibility for the outcomes portion of the contract, and then they sort of spot purchase particular interventions from local organizations within their area. And so you see essentially this convening power of one single organization working on behalf of a larger network around it to make sure that the right kinds of resources are being pooled to then sort of benefit a particular individual within that project.
Okay, great. Should we move on now to talking about data? It's one of your favorite topics, Claire. And so, Nigel, you've already sort of like touched upon this. Obviously, data availability, data collections are key aspects that need to be taken into account when thinking about outcomes will be measured. So more specifically, you've already mentioned some of your advice around, look at the available sources of data. What are the key considerations should commissioners keep in mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of 2x2 here does a pretty crude but good job of articulating where and when things might go awry. Chiefly, administrative data can often be less expensive and more accurate, but you don't get to decide what is in that administrative data, so it may not be fit for purpose. For primary data, you can, because you're deciding what you're collecting, you get to ensure that it's exactly what you need. But it comes with cost, both in sort of the financial, just collecting it, but also the administrative burden on those organizations that will be helping you with that data collection. And often it's more difficult to assure quality for primary data collection. So when we think through what makes good measurement, we want to reduce as much bias and error as possible. And so sometimes in primary data collection, you have issues where you've not used a reliable collection instrument, so the questions you're asking aren't validated elsewhere. You might be collecting information at the wrong time or on the wrong population. And then also there's just the data entry kinds of issues that arise.
Okay, great. So on that, I think it's a probably good time to sort of like move on to by far the most common questions we've received from our participants, which is around the difference between cohort and individual measurement. You've already said a few words about this, so perhaps I'll go to Claire now to maybe, I think just for the sort of like purpose of clarity, do you want to start just by explaining maybe again kind of what the difference is between the two approaches, and then just reflect a little bit on the advantages and disadvantages?
Sure. So a cohort outcome measurement is effectively when you look at the achievement across a group of individuals and sort of look at the reduction or improvement that is particular to that entire group. And usually you'll compare that to a very similar group. An individual outcome measurement is looking specifically at how a person operates through the intervention and what kinds of outcomes they achieve individually over the sort of larger life cycle of the intervention. So in terms of examples of a cohort versus an individual outcome, cohorts, probably in the UK, one of the more famous examples is going to be the Peterborough SIB, where you had essentially the payments made on the cohort reduction across 3 separate cohorts of, I think it was 7.5% reduction in reconvictions. And for individual outcome measurements, probably the DWP, the Innovation Fund rate card is probably the most talked about example of that, where you essentially have a menu of outcomes with an expressed maximum willingness to pay against those outcomes, and then sort of payment made on the basis of individuals ticking off each of those outcomes through their own journeys through an intervention.
Okay, great. So I've got loads of questions around sort of cohort and individual measurement, but before we go any further, we've got a couple of questions around data. So perhaps before we move any further, if we take a couple of questions. So perhaps for you, Claire, are there any examples of academic research data being used to test outcomes? Does data have to be government or official in nature?
I guess I'm not exactly sure what is meant by academic research data. Chiefly because we see a lot of academic research using the administrative data that would be used for these kinds of projects. If the question is more around, do we see tools that have been developed in academia being used to collect information for these projects? Yes, we do have examples of validated survey instruments and self-report instruments that have come from academia and are being used. Off the top of my head, I think of the loneliness scale that's used in reconnections. That was validated at UCLA. So
great.
Yeah, I was saying there are lots of tools used that way, but Peterborough is an example, really. But it was government sponsored. So government said, we want, Peter's a classic example, one of the very first SIBs, and I think it it was great in lots of ways, but it took us down one particular direction. It was very much designed at the time, despite what happened previously, as a tool from which the Ministry of Justice could properly evaluate the effectiveness of a particular intervention with a particular cohort. Therefore, they demanded a very high bar on the measurement of the outcome, and it was academically designed and validated. And if you've ever read the reports, there are 46 pages long, 44 pages of which is explaining the methodology of getting the answer, and the last two actually tells you what the answer is. So it's very...
that's a good point. So Peterborough the evaluators were based at universities, so there was definitely overlap between the academic and the practitioner communities there.
Okay, maybe we'll take one more data question just because it's so central to today's topic. And I'll come to you for this because obviously you've been involved in so many payment by results, social impact ones projects. So from your experience, how can projects, both commissioners, providers, investors and so on, deal with the time lag issue? So when data isn't available immediately, for example, so some data is only available with a big time lag, for example, teenage pregnancy, or the measuring the effects of the intervention can't be done immediately, and then you have to wait a number
it's
of
one
years.
of those, when I was saying people sit in rooms and then talk to other people, it's one of those considerations. Some service and payment by results contracts have had very long time lags, and investors and others have been very comfortable to wait for their money effectively. So the biggest challenge with time lag of data is saying, are people patient enough to wait that long before they get payments? Clearly, providers will be fine with it if they're being paid up front and the investor is taking the risk. Investors may also be fine with it, but this is where people say, okay, we're happy to use that data set that we don't get results for 2 years, but we will need perhaps an interim measure that shows that is going to happen. So that's where progression measures may become very important. So how do we know that the teenage pregnancy figures are going to show the results? So we need and find a lead indicator that will show perhaps something that measures changed behaviour. But the other problem you have with lag data, I think, is making sure you're measuring comparable data sets. Claire's got some slides coming up about the challenge of comparatives, but things can change a lot. Teenage pregnancy, the teenage pregnancy rate in this country has fallen quite rapidly due to exogenous factors that are very little to do with intervention.
Great. I mean, I did say that was going to be the last data question, but I think we got one more question I think is really good, and I'll come to Claire for that because she has herself designed those surveys, so I thought it's only appropriate that I ask you this question. So presumably a question from a provider. They're saying one of their concerns is the amount of surveys disseminated from the local authority. Are there any alternative mainstream tools to collect data that don't require a survey method?
I suppose, there are a number of different tools that are designed to help alleviate some of the burden of administering surveys. In terms of how you would collect the same kind of information that you would get from a survey through other tools, if I understand the question correctly, I don't have a particularly good answer for that, chiefly because often surveys are used because they're the more expedient way to get qualitative information.
Or do you think maybe the issue is that surveys are not designed well enough and then you end up with really lengthy surveys not asking the right questions?
Yeah, so that's definitely one of the difficulties for primary survey or primary data collection generally, is that you may not have the best, most seamless, easy to use tool being used. But there are definitely survey platforms to help at least the user experience be improved, if not the survey questions themselves. Yeah.
Great, thank you both. So I think if we go back to our slides, and so we were talking about the difference between cohort and individual measurements. I think one of the things you've mentioned, Claire, was the counterfactual. This is obviously really important when talking about cohort level measurement. We try to avoid jargon as much as possible, but inevitably, I suppose, a lot of conversations about outcomes somehow end up mentioning things like counterfactuals, deadweight, attribution. So please, could you just enlighten us all by explaining what a counterfactual is, and then again reflect a bit on how it's used in measuring the impact of an outcomes project?
At its most basic, a counterfactual is the outcome that we didn't see. And so it's this comparison between what actually happened in the real world and what would have happened in this alternative world where the intervention didn't occur. Because we can't observe a person both with and without a particular intervention, we start getting creative about how we might mimic what that alternative world is, what that counterfactual looks like. And so impact evaluation is essentially this way to compare the outcomes of interest for those who benefited from an intervention, the treatment group, against a group of people who are similar in all aspects to that treatment group. And that is called the comparison or the control group. And those folks are just like the treatment group, but they didn't receive the same intervention. And so there's this whole range of experimental and quasi-experimental methods that we use to try to pick at what the differences are between these two groups in terms of their achievement of outcomes. So probably the most notable example of this is the randomized control trial, so an RCT, where you randomly decide who gets put into the treatment group and who gets put into the control group. And the reason that economists really like RCTs is because they ensure that the control or comparison group, on average, is just like the treatment group. And so the reason we spend so much time, right, trying to think through how alike these two groups are is because when a comparison group or a control group doesn't accurately estimate the true counterfactual, when it doesn't actually hold within it all of the similar characteristics of the treatment group, the estimate of the impact is going to be very biased. So the estimate of the impact of the intervention is biased. So the cartoon on the slide here features the worst heavyweight in the World Boxing Association. And so if your control group is Jimmy, who, even though he's the very best boxer in his class, the worst heavyweight in the World Boxing Association looks like an amazing boxer. But if you actually put him next to one of his competitors, someone else who is more like him, on average, statistically, than Jimmy, you actually learn that he's not a particularly good boxer, which is what you want to learn from an intervention. You want to put it against something that is a fair comparison.
So from a practitioner's perspective, Daniel, how difficult is it to actually identify a, good comparison group or,
It's very, very hard, and it isn't done very often for these reasons. It has been done, as I said in some of the tips, where evaluation of the true impact of the intervention is very important to the payment mechanism. In this country, we've tended to love the tariff and the rate card. What's important there is to find the best evidence you can get from previous research elsewhere into what the actual impact is going to be, because you've got to estimate the deadweight. So
right,
this is what, so I know we're going to come on to that, but that's what the difference. So I've been involved in very few where we've said, okay, we're going to measure this against either, certainly not a randomized control trial or anything else. I'm aware of SIBs that are measuring geographically, so you measure area A against area B. But if area B is Jimmy and area A is the other person, that's part of the problem. Demographics vary from area to area. So it becomes very difficult. But what a lot of what I do involves is trying to get the best data you can find from previous research that shows that in this case you will get this definite statistically significant impact on the basis of which you can then construct.
Okay, so because you've mentioned deadweight, maybe. Could you sort of really briefly articulate sort of very simply what deadweight is, and then perhaps also reflect on why it's important to have a good estimate of the level of deadweight, particularly when using rate cards?
Sure. So as I mentioned, one of the reasons you would embark on an impact evaluation, and as Neil mentioned as well, is so that you can get an estimate of what outcomes would have been achieved without the intervention. And the estimate of this outcome is called the deadweight. So if we're entering into a very grossly simplified world, right? Impact is effectively everything that the treatment and the intervention achieves, accounting for or minus the deadweight. So if we think about this in a very crude example, you might have 10 children in a residential care who are being given a therapeutic intervention to step them down into a family-based placement. And so after they receive that therapeutic intervention, let's say 8 of those children step down successfully into a family-based placement. So you want to compare that 8 children successful placement to perhaps 10 other very similar children in a very similar residential care home who don't receive the same therapeutic intervention. And let's say 2 of those individuals actually step down into family-based placements. That 2 is the dead weight. And so the impact is going to be the 8 minus the 2. So the impact of that therapeutic intervention is 6 successful family-based placements. Now, the reason that this is important, particularly when you think through the implications for the use in a rate card, is that because the prices attached to outcomes in rate cards may or may not build into it a particularly robust account of what the dead weight is, you leave the sort of commissioner or payer of outcomes vulnerable to paying for things that would have occurred anyway. And so because it doesn't have that estimate, you may leave...
So the commissioner stands to pay for things that would have been achieved anyway.
Yes.
Okay, in a nutshell.
But some will take that risk, right?
Yeah.
So quite a lot will take that risk. They will say, we would rather pay for it. We would rather do it that way and have something that is administratively capable of being done at a relatively low cost, because as long as they've got a reasonable prospect that a high number of the outcomes wouldn't have been achieved anyway, and they won't do it. Interesting example Claire's used, which is a really good example, is one where people often say there is no dead weight. Like, kids in residential care don't spontaneously return home. The data tends to show they don't. So in some areas it's been argued there isn't any, and therefore you can reliably say you don't need to make any assumption about dead weight. But evidence from previous evaluations has shown that dead weight has tended to be underestimated, not over.
Yeah, and I think it's important that a rate card does have different benefits, right? And so one of them being that often it will be easier to negotiate and set up a deal using a rate card than on the back of a payment mechanism that perhaps builds in an evaluation component. Sometimes that's an easier project to set up.
Great. So Claire, just because you've mentioned impact evaluation, I think we had a question earlier asking about the difference between outcomes, measuring outcomes, and evaluating the impacts of a service. Are they the same? What are the sort of differences?
Well, I suppose you might think about them in maybe 2 camps. So you can achieve outcomes, right? But if you don't necessarily compare those to something else, you won't have an appreciation for what or how many of those outcomes would have been achieved otherwise. So it's sort of on what logic does your deal rest? Does it rest on a performance management logic, in which case what you're trying to do is track progress over time, and so all of those are valid things to pay upon? Or are you trying to base your project on sort of an evaluative logic, in which case you actually do want to delineate the difference between impact and just the crude achievement of outcomes?
Okay, great. So we've got an interesting question from our audience, which is around the alternatives to measuring counterfactuals that are not RCTs. Obviously, you've mentioned RCTs, so...
Sure. So you have a host of tools that fall under the category of quasi-experimental evaluation design. So those will include sort of comparing more rigorously what happened pre and post a treatment. You might look at matching individuals. So you create sort of a synthetic comparison group through a process called propensity score matching. You also can take advantage of the referral criteria and set up some comparisons around potentially referral thresholds. So if you have an age threshold or a behavior or something that is kind of relatively arbitrary in what constitutes someone getting an intervention and not, you can use those thresholds to sort of, or take advantage of those thresholds as a way to create a comparison group.
Great,
but it's probably not worth going into.
Well, and that all of that is entirely valid in a number of cases. In most cases, people say, "Oh God, that's all too hard, or too expensive, or too time-consuming." So they will look for a tariff, or the most common comparator, which is the least perfect, is historic baseline. So this is what happened in the 4 years before the intervention. This is what we will measure against that in the 4 years of the intervention. And often outcomes get ruled out because you say, well, hang on, government changed the persistent absence in schools. The government completely changed the definition 2 years ago. So if you say, great, we've got an easy to collect measure, oh dear, they completely changed the definition, and comparing that with historic data with what will happen now is really tough. So we'll either have to collect the data in the old way for our purposes or construct something else, and it becomes quite challenging.
And just on this point about evaluation, I think it's worth adding that within the Go Lab, we've got some fantastic researchers, and they're always happy to talk to projects or really anyone interested in understanding more about the evaluating impact of outcomes-based projects. So if you've got any questions, to get in touch with us. You can find our contact details on our website. Claire and Elle have also produced an evaluation how-to guide, which is also available on our website. Just conscious it can be quite technical, so I think quite often people just prefer to ask us a question. So anything to do with evaluation, we love talking about evaluation, so do get in touch with us. So I think if we just move on, so we talked about setting outcomes, thinking about the measurement and the options around that. So if we move on now to thinking about the metrics or the triggers, and I'll come to you, Neil, for that question. How do you get the right balance between stretch and achievability in setting metrics? I feel like this is a fundamental question for commissioners, so unsurprisingly, it pops up in the questions they've submitted in advance of today's session.
Well, the first point to make is it may not, depending on the structure of the deal, it may not be the provider. It may be the investor that gets discouraged, because the investor may be taking the risk on the achievement more than the provider. But both may be discouraged. Evidence is important again. If you've got a good evidence base, if it's something you know that's been done many times, multisystemic therapy and similar interventions that we know is good evidence base. I was involved in one a few months ago where we were trying to import something from the US. There was a good evidence base in the US, in which we were able to make some reasonably robust assumptions of what good looked like at a base case. What tends to happen is that you try to, what I would encourage people to do is you're trying to set your payment level so that the base level is what is reasonably achievable. So it will stretch people a bit. It may challenge them a little, but it's not going to be unachievable. If you do that, if you set that too high and say we need too high a level of achievement, then it's likely to fall over bluntly. The investors just say we're not going to take that because there's a too high a level of risk. But you can then set stretch targets, or you can, if you structure that differently, it will encourage everybody to overachieve, and that's what you're trying to do. And
then you've mentioned looking at the existing evidence, and presumably commissioners can also look at the existing projects or talk to their colleagues who have developed projects in similar policy areas. I guess for the Go Lab, we say don't try to reinvent the broken wheel, so kind of like look at what failed as well as what works and try to learn from that.
Totally, but I think the biggest one of the biggest concerns in this area is that you don't push it too far. There's a concern often that commissioners and procurement teams want to create tension in the payment mechanism. They want the best possible deal, but the best possible deal in an outcomes-based contract isn't the lowest price. And everyone always parrots that in every contract, but in this it definitely isn't the lowest price. Trying to encourage people to bid down on price or bid up on outcomes is likely to not get you the best result.
So then again, I suppose the relational aspects come in, and so it's not just about getting the technical bits right, the data and so on, it's also about the relations you build with different stakeholders.
Yeah, and the important thing is the guide we wrote, and I had some help. Great for you to give me all the credit, but quite a lot of people peer reviewed it and helped. It was very much about the outcomes and not the payment, but as Claire emphasised in that triangle picture, the two are hugely related. You can have what you think is a great outcome measure doesn't have perverse incentives, but you can then build in a perverse incentive very quickly with the way you set the payment towards it. So the two really get, I tend to think of them progressively when working with teams. So you say, let's do the outcomes first and then think about the payment. But they are closely interrelated, and you can often find that the payment makes you have to reconsider the metric. So those things do come out.
And then, so I suppose in terms of like other practical considerations to keep in mind when setting outcome metrics, do you want to say a few words about the impact of uncontrolled?
Well, yeah, I think we've had some questions today. We always get questions. I always get questions like, how can you ensure perfect attribution? You can't, bluntly. We're talking about areas that impact heavily on social factors, on demographics, on policy change. So that's why the deadweight is important if you've got an evidence base. But even that evidence base will not replicate the factors as they may be today, or as they may be in the particular area you're working in. So you just try to to take them out as much as possible. As I said, this is why I don't look for perfection, because if it did, you'd never achieve anything. And I often find you can get, this is probably a slightly controversial thing to say, but you can get blockers in organisations. So people who don't want this to happen will raise the attribution flag and say, but unless I get perfect attribution, I'm not going to back this. Well, okay, then in that case, let's all go home.
But from an academic perspective, though, Claire, so like, how do you feel about that kind of, attribution is clearly very important, sort of?
Sure. I mean, I think it's important to probably be explicit about the fact that, all of the tools that we have to measure attribution are estimates. Like, we're just trying to get as accurate as possible. I don't think anyone is claiming that we would get sort of a perfect world where we know exactly how much is attributable. So we know that the models have error in them, regardless of how rigorous they are. And there's a whole branch of evaluation that tries to be pragmatic about the realities of the operational environment on the ground. And so this is an area that people are trying to advance good work in without letting perfect be the enemy of good.
So I think other concerns that were raised by some of the commissioners we've got with us this morning were around sort of how do you mitigate things like sort of like changes in government policy, or even like internal changes, restructures within the commissioning authorities? Yeah,
there's a bit in the guide about this. I certainly avoid an outcome measure that is going to be heavily impacted like that. If you know that the new Secretary of State for Education is going to completely change the marking system for GCSEs, and don't set an outcome metric that is heavily dependent on that. If you know that you're about to restructure your organisation in a way that is going to change the whole base on which things are done, or if you know that you're going to introduce an in-house family service that is going to be competing for the same cohort, then don't do that. But again, this is where you get another thing. The homogeneity of your cohort and the extent to which you can ring fence your cohort and say it isn't susceptible to those external factors will be great. But then you might get someone say, but that's not the cohort we want to address. It's just because it's perfect. Again, one of the biggest challenges is getting everything that works technically to work for what you're actually trying to do, service-wise, user-wise, and trying to find a compromise between the two.
And again, in the guide, you sort of like, in terms of like practical advice, and I guess I should emphasize that the technical guide was written with commissioners in mind.
Yeah,
so it's very much kind of taking the commissioner's perspective, and you talk about involving providers in the decision-making process. So I think perhaps if you reflect a little bit of that, particularly in relation to social impact ones, for example, I know sometimes people have concerns as to the extent to which they can engage with providers before going out for full procurement of the contract.
Well, none of the commissioners I've worked with have found it a particular issue. I mean, clearly, if you're talking at an early stage and you give that opportunity, there are lots of ways you can do that, and clearly you've had a procurement webinar not long ago, and I happily talk about those issues. But I do think it's important. You will get more from talking to providers and investors, 3 or 4, the ones who really know their way around this or have been involved before, than you will waste a lot less time. Okay, let's put it that way. And you can be robust and say, we're not going to share it. We think we know what we're doing. But you'll get some. There've been plentiful examples of where that sort of feedback has helped.
Great, thank you. So when you talked about the importance of looking at the existing evidence when setting realistic or trying to set realistic metrics, so we've got someone from our audience asking us about sort of like, how do you do that when it's a completely new, highly innovative intervention? What do you do in that case? And any thoughts?
Damn,
I think it's important to flag that we don't necessarily see a lot of SIVs where the intervention itself is not kind of evidence-based. I mean, minimally, we're looking at interventions that have some semblance of an evidence base behind them. Whether or not that's because investors aren't willing to back riskier interventions, I don't have a view on. But again, we do see a lot of evidence-based interventions. So in the US, we've seen Nurse-Family Partnership. In the UK, we have MST and a number of other sort of very evaluated and sort of proven interventions being used.
It is a very good question, and it's quite challenging. I think, you need to look for the best you can. You also need to talk constructively to a range of investors about whether they might back something solely because it's innovative. There are some investors who are going to be more comfortable with something that has a reasonable evidence base, will take some risk on the upside of the outcomes being achieved, but aren't comfortable with investing in something where all of it may be completely misguided. There are other investors who may take that view.
And does it help if the service is backed by a really robust like theory of change that sort of like clearly demonstrates how they're seeking to make an impact?
I don't really have an.
I think it's an interesting one, because in the other part of the business I'm involved in, which is working with third sector providers on their impact and its measurement and management, theory of change is huge. So it's all about understanding what you're trying to achieve and what impacts it has. I have seen very little theory of change work brought into interventions. So I think there is an argument there, but an interesting question is it changes the relation. Many of the advisors in the market don't do a lot of work in theory of change. So you'd need probably more than one advisor if you were going to get that. An advisor who's very good at helping you with metrics and payments isn't necessarily the person who's going to help you on theory of change. But theory of change isn't going to solve the problem, I don't think, of something that has very, very little evidence base. It will give you more comfort of where the impacts might be. At the end of the day, you do need a number. That's where I find it most challenging. You need to say this will have 37% impact, or is likely to. And if you don't have that, an issue, I'd say something slightly controversial. You always find that when you do have the evidence, and you say the evidence is 16% net impact, nobody likes the answer, because it makes it much harder. So you say, okay, it's got to be better than that, so let's bump it up to 30. And that's where people you're asking to back this deal will do their diligence, and they can look at the same research sources that you did. So it's not necessarily a good idea.
So we've mentioned the dreaded perverse incentives earlier. So if we move on to that now, you said you don't like the word.
It's only because it implies that it implies, particularly having formerly worked for private sector providers, social interventions, it's always used and implied that the private sector is gaming the system, and sometimes the third sector is gaming the system. All systems get gamed in lots of ways, but the main point is you're trying to avoid things that will lead to outcomes that are not the ones you want.
And so, just for the sake of clarity, maybe Claire, would you like to just sort of like try to quickly summarize what it's commonly referred to as like perverse incentives, and again bring in some examples if possible?
Yeah, I think Neil brings up a good point where it's when we talk about perverse incentives, we don't want to connote that anyone is acting maliciously or nefariously, right? People are responding to this incentives in front of them. But I think it's good to perhaps walk through what kinds of behaviors that we might be talking about. And so chiefly when you think about opportunistic behavior or gaming, there are three kinds of behaviors you might pay attention to. There's cherry picking, which is sort of referring only the easiest to treat onto the intervention. There's the creaming, which is sort of a post-referral, only working with folks that are the easiest to treat. And in a PBR context, only perhaps working with those you can sort of work with to a payable outcome. And then there's the sort of converse, which is parking, which is the post-referral, you reallocate effort away from individuals who are more difficult to treat. So if we think through maybe an example for cherry picking, let's say there's a program that is supposed to increase educational attainment for a variety of young persons, so people who are in school and perhaps out of school, and maybe the provider organization only targets those who are already in school, making it a bit easier for them to accumulate perhaps higher qualifications.
Okay. Do you have any other examples maybe that you've seen the most like frequent sorts of like errors that people make, creating unintendedly maybe the wrong kind of incentives?
Yeah, measuring, and one I see quite a lot is saying we will measure the effectiveness of this outcome by fewer referrals to another agency, say children and adult mental health services. You can use that sort of measure, and a lot of commissioners may be interested in that if those services are under pressure and they want to reduce demand. You have to be careful that you don't then create an incentive not to make referrals where they are appropriate. And you can get around, I mean, the one way around is to have some sort of mechanism that says, if a referral needs to be made, we will pay the cost of the intervention up to that point, or we will pay all the provider's costs. So they're not incentivized to say, we don't want to make that referral, we'll lose that outcome payment in a while. The other one, that the example is about payments being important as opposed to the outcome itself.
Sure.
Is this one about what are sometimes called bullet payments, cliff edge payments, and I've been involved in quite a few of those, so I had to learn this one the hard way. It seems fairly straightforward. You say, we'll pay at 3 months, we'll pay at 6 months, we'll pay at 9 months, but then you create an incentive. Well, you create a risk for both sides if decisions have to be made. So you say, I don't want to make that decision now. I don't want to tell the local authorities that that child really needs to go into care because a payment is due in 3 weeks' time. And similarly, a local authority will say, sorry, we've made the decision that child has to go. Neither of them may be acting maliciously, but the problem will arise, and that's why there's been evolution of payment mechanisms to solve that.
Great, thanks. So Neil, you've mentioned, a couple of times throughout this session that the whole process of setting outcomes, measures, and metrics is an iterative one. So I was wondering if you could sort of give us a real life example, and I think we've got one actually, sort of just summarize on this slide, kind of how the
that was in my head when I was thinking, because I thought of that one. So when we first had Educare SIPs, you had cohort-wide measurement of the total number of days in care. So that's a classic baseline comparator. It worked okay, but it's into those issues we talked about earlier. It's time consuming, it's lag data, it costs a lot of time and effort. You can get into arguments about it. So then we moved, and some of the SIPs I worked on 2013-14, people were saying, well, let's pay every 3 months or 6 months and do it per individual. The child is remained out of care or has been reunified out of care and all those sorts of things. But that leads to those issues we talked about just literally 30 seconds ago about you may get some perverse incentive. What's tending to happen, most people are doing it this way now, is you combine sort of both those approaches but do it in real time. So you're paying for the number of care days saved, and you pay that at intervals. But if that includes a period where the child had to go back into care for respite for the care or whatever, then that's fine, because it won't harm the payment in overall terms, and it will take away those distortions, because there's no real fear of saying, okay, we've been paid to this point, that's fine, we will get paid up to this point, so we can, whatever decision is made by whichever party. So it seems to be fairest, and that's a really good example actually, where it's just people learn from experience. So don't do it this way, do it that way. What I sometimes see is people still doing it this way, and so, well, why are you doing it that way? Because they don't have access to they haven't understood that there's a different way of doing that. So.
Great. So as we're getting closer to the end of our session, I think it'd be helpful to sort of go back to our what we call the triangle of designing a robust framework. So obviously, throughout these sessions, we've talked about outcomes, but cohort definition, price setting. I think someone made a comment in the chat around the payment mechanisms. So just bringing all this together, Clay, if you wouldn't mind sort of just perhaps illustrating in practice with a real life example as to what good would look like in setting a good outcomes contracts.
Sure. So I suppose it's maybe worth walking through this with a bit more detail across each of the 3 dimensions, and then, as Andrea suggested, walking through an example. We've talked a lot about outcomes and sort of hinted at the interdependence of these 3 things within a deal itself. And so chiefly when we think about combining them to create a way for commissioners specifically to avoid perverse incentives, we want to think about a very tightly defined eligible cohort. So we want clear and objective criteria upon which people receive an intervention. And we either need sort of homogeneity, so a similarity between those folks who are being referred, or we need to have a very good appreciation for the ways in which they differ, and build out some sort of routine, whether it's auditing or a differential of payment, something like that, to ensure that the effort of supporting people to a payable outcome is not sort of misallocated or, as we suggested, creamed and parked. We also then want an independent referral. So we don't want to give folks who have standing or stake in who they work with too much say in what that eventual roster might look like for individuals that will be receiving the intervention. In the outcomes section, we have spent quite a lot of time there, but I guess I'll just underscore that we want to ensure that there's this logical link or a sort of a valid causal claim between activities, outputs, and then your eventual payable outcomes. You want to ensure that the time period upon which you're tracking those is suitable. We have seen deals where the actual policy intent is much longer term than the outcomes they're actually paying for. And then you want to be able to know if the effect for individuals in the service is stuck, right? You want to know how durable the outcomes are that you've paid for. And then lastly, there's this idea of price setting. And so to create a good price on outcomes, you want to have a robust estimate of the deadweight, which we've gone through. You want to have confidence then that those outcomes are attributable to the intervention. And again, you want to ensure that there's enough time over which data can be tracked and benefits can accrue, so that you know that the payments are based in something that's not fiction, but is a sort of real case. So when we think about, in the UK context, what a good example of this looks like, we often go to Peterborough. And in terms of this idea of clear cohort eligibility, we're looking at offenders within a particular prison with sentences less than 12 months over 3 cohorts of 1,000 individuals. The participation was voluntary, but everyone who was eligible was referred. And so in terms of the policy intent, the idea was to reduce reoffending. And as we've talked about, it paid on the basis of reconviction, which is a proxy measure, but we know that there's quite a close linkage between reconvictions and reoffending. And then in terms of the price point, we do see that for Peterborough, we had a real-time estimate of deadweight calculated through a comparator group, which was constructed over the same time period for folks in prison who had the same attributes as those in Peterborough. So we had some sort of assurance that the outcomes that were achieved through this SIB were because of the intervention offered. We don't know necessarily what the SIB itself did, but we know that the intervention was effective.
Right, that's really helpful, thank you. So going back to our audience, if you have any questions, please do submit them using the chat box. We've got about 5 minutes perhaps, we could take a couple more questions. While people are thinking perhaps about their questions, we've been going through a lot of content this morning, so I think I'd like to ask you both to sort of like summarize your 2-3 top tips for commissioners, key takeaways that you want people to take from this session. So Claire, I will perhaps start with you.
Sure. I know that it's very easy perhaps to think of evaluation as this real like drag and drain on resource and time, and it isn't particularly valuable, but I suppose a better way to think about evaluation is a way to mitigate risk. It's not necessarily just a tick box exercise, and it has the potential to improve subsequent decision making, particularly around the interventions that you might elect to arrange in a particular area. And so irrespective of whether or not a project that you're working on might move forward with an impact evaluation, I would say that the thinking behind what constitutes a good one is a helpful framework through which you can design more robust value for money cases. And so think of evaluation as not necessarily going and executing one, but as a way to think through the eventual problems or shortcomings and sort of stress test your own thinking. And so in that sense, it's an idea that both the technical side of things and the relational side of things are equally important, and you can't just nail one, you want to nail both.
Great, thanks. How about you, Neil?
3 things, as I discussed quite a lot. Be prepared to be flexible and iterative, keep trying. If the first metric doesn't work, another one will. Second, partly because you need flexibility and you need to learn from others, then make sure that you build that flexibility into the system. There's a famous quote generals use that say a strategy for battle never survives first contact with the enemy. Your outcomes framework won't survive first contact with procurement. But it will likely to say substantially the same. But if you're concerned about some aspects, then leave them open and let other people discuss that. And again, that's in the guide as part of the step-by-step approach. And an increasingly important one, I think, if someone else, don't reinvent a broken wheel, and don't reinvent a wheel, because as more and more SIBs are done and more people have done it, if they haven't used the obvious direct metric and they've used a proxy, that's because the direct metric somebody else has thought through and thought it doesn't work very well. And also, if you use that proxy, then the chances are the market will say, oh yeah, we get that. We've used that before. So they'll be fine with it, and it will be much easier to get providers and investors to buy into the deal.
Great, thank you. So we've got a couple of questions from our audience. So yes, the recording of the webinar will be posted on our website very shortly after this morning's session. So watch the space, and we'll obviously share the slides as well. And there's a question, I don't know whether I'm reading it correctly, but I think it's referring to, I suppose, the ability of outcomes-based approaches to influence incentivize the behavior of service providers. I think we've touched upon that, but did you have any further reflections on that?
I think that that is definitely a question that people are looking at, particularly in the academic space, this idea of what actually happens to frontline delivery staff in an outcomes-based contract, and do you see providers reacting differently to the incentives in front of them? I don't have anything concrete necessarily to offer here as evidence, but I think, certainly a lot of it will depend on how that contract is communicated down, and our hope is that it would align people to a common goal, perhaps, but I don't have anything necessarily to point to.
The biggie, it's not published, the biggest single finding we have from the CBO evaluation so far is that an outcomes-based culture, if I can put it in those terms, does make a difference to lots of people. So lots of people think differently about things. Some people say that that's not always a positive, but sometimes it's a negative impact because they feel under more pressure, even if the risk is theoretically being borne somewhere else. But it's certainly, there is some evidence that thinking about outcomes, if that's the question, does make a difference.
Great, thank you both very much. Well, we've obviously covered as many of the questions as possible. I'm sure we haven't answered all the questions. Well, glad to see from the chat box that at least some of our participants found it helpful. If you want, so we've referenced the how-to guide on setting and measuring outcomes quite a few times. So on this slide, you've got the direct web address for that. If you've got specific questions about the project, the SIG project, or any outcomes-based approaches that you're working on, we're always very keen to speak to commissioners, practitioners, providers, and so on. So to get in touch with us, we run weekly advice surgeries on a Tuesday morning. So again, if you go online, you can book a slot with us. And then for those of you based specifically in the West Midlands region, we've got an event coming up looking specifically at innovative approaches to outcomes-based commissioning, and that's on the 22nd of May in Birmingham. And before we lose everyone, we're really be grateful for your feedback on the session. So really quickly, if I could ask you to go on to slido.com/outcomes. It's the briefest survey ever. It's literally 3 very quick questions. It would just be immensely helpful for us to understand what was particularly helpful throughout the session, what could have been better. We spend a lot of time talking to commissioners, and we're just really keen on getting their feedback just to ensure that all the materials and the events we produce are as relevant, as helpful as possible. Equally, if you've got any particular comments, you can always get in touch with us by email. Again, the contact details are on our website. So I guess that literally takes us to the end of the session. Claire and Neil, thank you ever so much for joining us this morning. I found it really helpful. I hope our participants did too. And yes, please go on to Slido and share your thoughts, your feedback with us. And I guess as a last point for me, a couple of questions we had were around payment mechanisms and other things that are related to setting and measuring outcomes. So if you've got suggestions for further webinar sessions, evaluation feels like it'd be a potential good contender, so do let us know. I think that's all from us. Thank you to our audience for all the great questions. Bye-bye.